The Naval Command headquarters of the Atlantic Division hummed softly with the polished rhythm of ceremony. Rows of officers in immaculate white uniforms filled the grand hall, their medals catching the light with every movement. The air smelled faintly of brass and aftershave. The sound of shoes on marble punctuated by low laughter and the muted clink of decorations against fabric. It was the kind of gathering where order itself felt like a living thing, pulsing with history and pride. In the last row sat a woman who didn't belong there, at least not in the eyes of the room. Elena Hart, dressed in a plain gray jacket worn at the elbows, kept her hands folded neatly on her lap. The scars that traced her knuckles and wrists looked old, the kind that healed without ever really fading. Around here, conversation flowed easily, a mix of small talk and ambition. A lieutenant leaned toward his companion, wondering under his breath who had allowed a civilian into a restricted ceremony. His companion smirked and shrugged, already looking away. Elena didn't react. She sat with quiet posture, back straight, head slightly bowed, as if the noise of medals and titles were from a world she once knew but no longer belonged to. Her eyes moved occasionally toward the front, where an oversized screen displayed the name of each recipient. The speeches rolled on in practiced rhythm. Words about duty, honor, and service echoing through the room. Rear Admiral Thomas Pierce made his way down the aisle, the lines of his uniform crisp, the motion of his stride measured by decades of habit. He nodded to officers as he passed, offering brief smiles, a hand on a shoulder, a quiet word of recognition. Then he saw her. His eyes dropped to her wrist where her sleeve had shifted slightly, revealing a burn pattern he knew too well. Circular marks etched deep into skin. He stopped walking. For a long second, nothing in the room moved. Then his voice, quiet but absolute, carried through the silence. "You're her." The sound rippled like a shockwave, without needing another word. Every officer in the hall rose to their feet. The air thickened with realization. And for the first time that evening, no one spoke. The hum of machinery filled the engineering control room aboard the USS Resolute, a Ford-class carrier cutting through dark Atlantic waters under radio silence. It was 2:40 a.m. when Lieutenant Commander Elena Hart, engineering maintenance chief for the night shift, leaned over the console, checking reactor temperature logs. The readings were steady, coolant flow balanced. Everything as routine as it could be during an operation codenamed Siren Gate. She had just begun a systems check when a deep vibration rolled through the deck plates, followed by the sharp metallic crack of impact on the port side. The ship lurched, warning lights flared red. The voice over the intercom broke with static. "Missile strike. Port side. Frame 422. Fire in the reactor bay." Alarms erupted across the room. Red strobes cut through smoke curling from ruptured panels. Elena reached for her headset, her voice steady despite the noise. "Bridge. This is engineering. We have a containment breach in progress. I'm sealing the lower bulkheads now." She barked orders to the technicians around her, sending 2 forward to check the secondary coolant loop. 1 didn't return. She pulled up the emergency schematic, hands moving fast, overriding automatic systems that had failed to close in time. Her training took over. Seal the deck. Contain the heat. Keep the coolant running. The radio filled with overlapping voices, commands colliding in panic. She tuned out everything except reactor status and coolant pressure, temperature rising fast. Critical thresholds minutes away. She activated the emergency reactor isolation protocol, locking down containment doors in sequence, one after another. The heavy bulkheads slammed shut, echoing like steel thunder. Her breathing slowed as she focused on procedure, fingers finding switches through muscle memory. The manual override lever stuck halfway. She braced herself against the console, forcing it into position. Sparks burst around her as she rerouted coolant flow through the redundant loop. The radio came alive again. Marcus Chen's voice, her engineering partner, was shouting for her to get out. The fire was spreading. He was 3 decks up, sealed behind the next bulkhead. She could almost hear the fear beneath his words. She glanced at the containment timer. 8 minutes to stabilization. Not enough time. She turned off the radio. The noise stopped, replaced by the low groan of metal under heat. The blast door behind her sealed automatically. She was alone in the reactor compartment now, the air shimmering with heat. Alarms fading into a dull hum. The deck vibrated like a heartbeat beneath her boots. She kept her eyes on the readout, watching the coolant levels climb back toward safe range. 11 minutes and 37 seconds later. The number steadied. She exhaled. 1 slow breath. Around hair. Silence returned. Heavy and final. Then the lights dimmed as power rerouted, and the last sound she heard before collapsing was the hiss of steam escaping through a fractured pipe. 4 hours after the containment alarms fell silent, the rescue teams reached the lower decks of the USS Resolute. The air was thick with the metallic taste of smoke and salt, and the heat still shimmered along the twisted bulkheads. Floodlights cut through clouds of steam, illuminating corridors that no longer existed. The deck plates had collapsed inward, fused into molten patterns of steel and silence. They found no movement, no bodies, only the remains of the containment doors sealed from the inside. The official report later noted that the engineering section had been completely destroyed. Damage control officers cataloged the scene with mechanical precision. Radiation levels remained high but contained the reactor stable. The ship was still afloat. By 0730, the executive officer signed the report, all hands lost in engineering deck 5. Containment successful. Reactor secure. Among the names listed as killed in action was Lieutenant Commander Elena Hart. The report reached Atlantic Command by early afternoon. Stamped and filed with commendation for exemplary sacrifice, the USS Resolute was cleared for tow and eventual repair. Its survival labeled a testament to emergency protocol and courage under fire. Days later, a memorial ceremony was held at the Naval Command headquarters. Rear Admiral Thomas Pierce stood at the podium, reading the names of those lost during Operation Siren Gate. His voice carried the weight of duty, steady and unbroken, as a flag moved gently behind him. He spoke of honor, service, and the quiet heroism of those who stayed behind. The audience listened, unaware that one of those names belonged to a woman who still breathed somewhere beyond their reach. Far from the ceremony, Elena Hart awoke in a civilian hospital. Her skin was bandaged, her breath shallow. The nurse told her she had been found adrift, pulled from debris by a fishing vessel. No military ID. No records. No family contact. She asked for her service file, but the clerk only shook his head. There was no record of her name in the Navy database. The system listed her as deceased. She sat there in silence for a long time, staring at her reflection in the hospital window. The world outside moved on, steady and indifferent. She felt no anger, only a kind of stillness. The calm that comes when everything has already been lost. They had buried her name with the others, and maybe, she thought, that was where it belonged. The hall inside the Naval Command headquarters shone with the kind of polish only found in places built for ceremony. Rows of officers filled the space, their dress whites crisp, ribbons gleaming under warm overhead lights. Conversations drifted through the air, quiet and practiced, a blend of career updates and polite pride. A few spoke about new assignments or overseas tours. Others compared the weight of medals pinned neatly against their chests. It was a gathering built on precision and presentation, the Navy's living image of control. At the back sat a woman who didn't match the pattern. Elena Hart, in a plain gray jacket, blended easily into the edge of the room. Her posture was calm but unmistakably trained, a stillness that only years of service could leave behind. Around hair, no one asked questions. She kept her hands clasped. the fabric at her sleeve, brushing against old scars that caught the light when she shifted slightly. The slideshow began, the projector humming, as images appeared on the large screen, fleet photographs, mission patches, the proud silhouette of the USS Resolute sailing through blue water. When the slide changed to the engineering crew, applause filled the room. The names of the fallen scrolled slowly beneath the photo. Elena's breath caught before she could stop it. Her fingers closed over her wrist, pressing against the burn marks that never faded. The faces in that photo smiled with the ease of people who never thought they'd be remembered this way. She stayed still, eyes lowered, until the lights brightened again and the sound of clapping faded into conversation. Rear Admiral Thomas Pierce moved down the center aisle, shaking hands and offering polite words to those seated nearest him. His steps were unhurried, practiced in the rhythm of command. As he approached the back rows, his eyes caught the way the civilian woman sat straight, not out of pride, but habit. He almost passed her until her sleeve shifted again. The sight of the circular burn scars stopped him cold. Recognition hit before thought did. He froze in place. The hall quieted as the shift in his expression drew notice. His voice cut through the murmurs, steady but changed. "You're her." The words were simple, but they broke the air. Conversations stopped. Chairs creaked. The world seemed to hold its breath. He gave the quiet order, "Stand up." Every officer in the hall obeyed at once. Instinct overriding confusion. Chairs scraping in unison. Elena didn't move. She sat where she was, calm, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. The Admiral's gaze softened as he raised his hand in a deliberate gesture, not regulation, but something deeper. The silence thickened until it became reverence, the kind that needed no sound to be understood. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of sound. Every officer in the hall remained standing, uncertain whether they were witnessing protocol or something beyond it. Rear Admiral Thomas Pierce lowered his hand slowly, his voice quieter now, but heavy with certainty. "Commander Hart, please come forward." The use of her title drew a ripple through the room. Some officers looked at each other in disbelief. Others already understood. Elena hesitated only a moment before standing. Her movement was deliberate, steady, the posture of someone who had lived by discipline long after leaving the uniform behind. She walked to the front under the weight of hundreds of eyes. Each step echoed against the polished floor, sharp and rhythmic. The air felt still, as if no one dared breathe until she reached the stage. Pierce waited beside the podium, his expression unreadable, but softened by respect. When she stopped in front of him, he spoke again, his voice carrying the kind of authority that did not need to be raised. "This is Commander Elena Hart, the one who saved the USS Resolute during Operation Siren Gate. Without her, that ship and its 1,200 crew would have been lost." A low murmur swept through the hall, disbelief mixing with awe. Elena's gaze stayed on the floor for a moment before lifting. Her voice was calm, controlled, the tone of someone who had given reports like this countless times. The impact occurred at 2:40 a.m. The missile struck the port side near frame 422. Breaching the secondary coolant loop, we lost pressure within 30 seconds. She paused briefly, then continued. "I was already in the engineering control room. We activated the emergency reactor isolation protocol. 3 bulkheads needed to be closed manually. There was no one close enough but me." Someone near the front spoke, almost whispering. "That was inside the containment zone." She nodded once. "Partial shielding. Enough to give me time. Radiation levels were high but manageable for a short window. I stayed until the coolant stabilized. 11 minutes. 37 seconds. After that, I don't remember much." Her delivery carried no pride, only precision. She sounded like a technician recounting data. But the weight of her words filled the hall. The officers around her began to realize the scale of her choice, the finality of it. Pierce's eyes didn't leave her. When she finished, He opened a small metal case he had carried under his arm. Inside lay the Navy Cross, untouched. Its ribbon faded slightly with age. He held it out toward her. "This was meant for you, Commander." It was never awarded. She looked at it for a long moment, then shook her head gently. "Keep it. Admiral, there are others who never came home. I just survived. That isn't the same." He wanted to argue, but her tone made it unnecessary. Around them, the officers stood silent, understanding what words could not express. Pierce closed the case and straightened, his shoulders heavy with a new kind of respect. For the first time, the institution he represented saw not a myth, but a person. The air in the hall changed. Softer now. Humbled, Elena met his eyes again. The faintest trace of exhaustion in her face. She had spoken the truth, not for recognition, but for release. And in that stillness, both of them seemed to understand that sometimes survival itself was the greatest act of service. For a long time, no one spoke. The room stayed caught between disbelief and reverence. The sound of breathing, the only movement in the space. Elena Hart stood where she had been, her eyes lowered, shoulders still squared, as if she had just finished a debrief rather than a confession. Then a young lieutenant in the second row shifted forward, his voice unsteady. "Why didn't you come back sooner?" "Ma'am." She looked up at him and smiled. A small, tired curve of the lips that held more understanding than regret. "Heroes, die in stories," she said softly. "Survivors just continue living." The words moved through the crowd like a slow wave. Some officers lowered their heads. Others looked at her with something close to shame. Rear Admiral Pierce, still standing beside her, took a breath before he spoke. "Command erased your name," he said quietly. "They wanted the record clean." She turned to him and shook her head. No anger, no accusation, only calm. "The Navy needed a story that made sense. I gave them one by staying gone." A murmur ran through the hall. "Quiet." Uncertain. One lieutenant whispered that she had walked through fire. Another corrected him in a low voice. "No." She held it back. Their words weren't for her, but for themselves. Trying to fit this truth into a world built on medals and ceremony. Pierce lowered his gaze, his voice steady, but stripped of command. "We should have found you." She answered simply, "You did, just later than you meant to." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, layered with everything unsaid. The sound of rain against the windows replaced applause, steady and rhythmic. Elena looked out over the crowd. Faces that had once been strangers, now linked by the same understanding. They were all learning what real honor looked like. And it had nothing to do with the stage they stood on. Pierce straightened. Not to give an order, but to acknowledge something greater. Without a word. He raised his hand in salute again. This time every officer followed. Not out of regulation, but out of respect. No one clapped. No one spoke. The moment stretched, heavy and cleansing. The kind of silence that would echo longer than any speech. And in that silence, the Navy finally remembered what courage sounded like. The ceremony ended quietly. The kind of ending that needed no applause. Officers filed out in slow silence, shoes clicking against marble, the sound fading as the doors closed behind them. The hall dimmed until only the soft glow of wall lights remained. Outside, rain began to fall, steady and unhurried. Washing against the steps of the Naval Command headquarters, Elena Hart stood for a moment near the entrance, watching drops collect on the windows, then turned toward the courtyard. The Navy Memorial spread before her, a long wall of black marble, etched with names that glistened under the rain. The air was cool and heavy, with salt from the nearby coast. Her jacket darkened as water soaked through the fabric. But she didn't move to shield herself. She reached out, fingers tracing along the carved letters, feeling each name under her touch. The rain ran down her hand, Mingling with the faint scars still visible beneath her sleeve, every name was a memory. Every engraved line, a life that had once depended on her choice. For the first time in 3 years, she read them all without looking away. The loss no longer felt sharp, only deep and quiet, like a tide that had settled after a long storm. Behind her, footsteps approached but stopped short of interrupting. Rear Admiral Thomas Pierce stood beside her, cap under his arm, his uniform already soaked. He said nothing for a while, only stood at attention beside her, sharing the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "They wouldn't have wanted you to disappear." She answered without turning. "I didn't disappear. I just waited until someone remembered why it mattered." He nodded once, the motion small but deliberate. She stopped tracing the wall when her fingers reached a single name: Lieutenant Marcus Chen. She lingered there, the rain streaking over the stone and down her hand. "I held the line for him," she whispered. Pierce's voice was quiet behind her. "I know." He came to attention again and raised his hand in a full, formal salute. She stood still, eyes on the wall, the reflection of both of them shimmering across the wet marble. The rain softened as if the world itself had exhaled. Elena lowered her hand and turned away, her footsteps steady on the slick pavement. Pierce stayed where he was, his salute falling slowly as her figure faded into the gray distance. In the reflection of the memorial, her outline remained for a moment longer before the rain carried it away. Some scars are not wounds. They are signatures of courage written in skin and smoke